Hi, Dr. Limmer.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me all right?
Yep. Awesome.
Great. Yeah, I'm walking back from a seminar, which is why I'm not sharing my video, but
Yeah,
maybe when I get back to my office, I will.
No worries. How are things at Cal?
Oh, they're wonderful. It's a beautiful day, nice and warm, lots of people around. So
Yeah, I mean, October is my favorite season in
oh, yes. Yeah, as long as there are no fires, October is very nice.
Yeah, true. I remember I think it was 17 and 18, right? There was two big fires, and I think
Oh, yes.
around half of Napa. And we were joking about maybe we should port some of those years' vintages.
Right.
Yeah, and actually, I was raised in Beijing, and the air quality was not good as I grew up, and
Oh.
the fire in California really make me homesick.
Oh, yeah. You know, it was funny. A significant part of my research group is from China, and they had all of the masks ready. So we got them from them when we had the fires. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of my colleague at the time was like 40 masks in 2017, got like 200 something, and he couldn't use it. And COVID came, he's selling at like $20 per mask.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, I mean, this whole COVID thing just really changed, our entire schedule. I actually,
Oh, absolutely.
visit the Bay Area around Thanksgiving every year. Haven't been able to do that for a while. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Hopefully soon.
Yeah, fingers crossed. There's so much things I missed about Berkeley, especially. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Awesome. So I think Linfeng may not be joining, so we can just kickstart if that's okay with you.
Yeah, fine with me.
Awesome. So yeah, just wanted to share a little bit context. So right now, Linfeng and us at the company are trying to push forward and make the concept of machine learning for molecular dynamics or broadly AI for science more applicable to not just the academic questions, but also real intangible industrial and application level questions. And that's why we're so interested in not just making the algorithm run faster, but see how people from different disciplines use it to solve their specific domain problem. What we realized is a lot of the advancement is actually driven by asking the right question and not just making better hammer and trying to fit problem into our nails. So
right.
Yeah, that's why and especially like air pollution has been with me my entire life. So your paper on the nitrogen pentoxide is very close to home kind of topic for me. And yeah, actually that would be my first question. What intrigued you about this this challenge, and what makes it so important, and what makes it so hard to tackle?
Yeah. So I should say that I am very much indebted to the CASE project, the Center for Atmospheric Aerosols. This is an NSF Chemical Innovation Center that's run out of UCSD by Kim Prather. So she brought me in to work with their team when I first started here at Berkeley about 2017. And it was really through them that I was introduced to this problem. So there's a team that was studying chemistry on atmospheric aerosol that was led by Gil Nathanson at Wisconsin. And they're the ones that really taught me that that there was an outstanding challenge in atmospheric chemistry associated with where does all of the NOx compounds go. So they just can't be accounted for correctly. The normal, the atmospheric models or the chemistry models that people had just really couldn't well predict where exactly NOx compounds end up in the atmosphere, and particularly in the nighttime air where NOx will form the stable molecule N2O5. What is the fate of that molecule in particular, especially when you think about it potentially reacting with aerosols that have very varied compositions, varied thermodynamic state points, etc. And so they are really the ones that are responsible for me getting involved with this project in particular. My background is theoretical chemistry, statistical mechanics. I've thought about reactions in complicated environments before, but by no means was I an expert in atmospheric chemistry in particular. And they really challenged me then to try to make some inroads with a theory and simulations to try to address this problem, given that there is a ton of literature, indirect measurements that kind of help constrain the problem. So there's a ton known about how many molecules of N2O5 get irreversibly taken up by a droplet. It's just the kind of molecular details that one would need to understand in order to then predict, well, if I change the composition of the droplet, what's going to be the impact of that uptake?
Like tiny black boxes.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's right. So this was a real challenge because, so it's certainly a kind of question that a lot of theorists would want to be able to address. But it is a really challenging system to study computationally, because it was known that the reaction occurs quickly. So if N2O5 is a gaseous molecule, it's going to come and react in an aerosol. If the reaction is fast, it doesn't have much time to get into the bulk of the aerosol, into the interior, which means that likely, even when we started, there was an idea that maybe a lot of the reactivity happens at the interface. And so this is what really makes it difficult to study computationally, is because if I want to study a system that reacts, I have to, at some point, confront quantum mechanics. I can't make and break bonds without solving Schrödinger's equation, which is costly computationally. Those calculations are big and complicated and slow, despite a lot of my colleagues' best efforts to make them faster. But people do study chemistry, and if it's just the gas phase, that's possible. And in fact, if it is a molecule in a liquid, it's also somewhat possible if you have enough patience. And that's because you can essentially carve out a very small piece of a liquid and then study the chemistry in it. But if you want to actually represent chemistry at an interface, this is very hard, because I have to actually have a big enough piece of the liquid that I could differentiate between an interfacial region and a bulk liquid behind it. And so just needing a big enough system and needing a quantum mechanical description of that system really made it intractable. It just couldn't be done. And that's where kind of AI and DeePMD in particular really came to our rescue. I had known about DeePMD because I had been at Princeton right as it was starting to be kind of worked on by Weinan and his group. And so I knew that, and I knew the work of kind of Bader and Parinello, Christoph Delago, that had been kind of using these things, not as much for reactivity, but for force field, non-reactive force field fitting. And so my very first postdoc, very courageous guy by the name of Mirza Galib, who's the first author on this paper, decided that we would try to figure out how to use DeePMD as a way of bridging the length scales that we really needed to bridge in order to simulate this interfacial chemistry system. And so it was really interesting. This was the right tool because if you can construct a force field that's reactive using a neural network, that gives you a linear scaling method. So you can really get to a very large system very computationally effectively. But we were doing this right as DeePMD was first being published, for general users, and so we really benefited a lot from their development team because we interacted with them quite a lot back and forth, both in just how to use DeePMD, making sure that the kind of features that we needed, physical constraints on the forces, like that they decayed to zero, so you conserve energy. That all that was in there, and so their receptiveness to our questions and our requests were invaluable. And so with that kind of tool, we were able to do this study in a way that I don't think anybody else without AI and without a neural network trained force field could have done.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And actually, I think for a general audience, by the way, my background is like the early generation of machine learning.
Great.
All the convolution neural network, just very simple 2-layer kind of running through kind of situation. But I guess when I was first introduced to Liping's work, my first question was how is this branch or utilization of AI intuitively different than those that are used on, say, computer vision or AlphaGo? Like, how is this different from your perspective as a user?
Yeah, so let's see. So first, let me think about how to answer that. So the strategies one uses in AI for something like AlphaGo, there's many steps before you get an indication of success. AlphaGo, you need to train a computer to develop some strategy, and then only after many moves do you know if that strategy is going to pay off. Right? So the kind of functions you fit are very different from the functions that you fit when you're trying to learn how molecules interact. So in some sense, it's a much simpler kind of problem. So the molecule, physics and chemistry is local. There's a range over which particles interact. But despite very creative minds, it's very hard to dream up functional forms for how forces will change with conformation or distance. And so, people have tried to fit reactive models with kind of linear models for a long time, and you just couldn't come up with good forms. And so, it's really kind of silly, but it was just the kind of universal function approximation ability of a neural network that just makes it really easy for us. There's nothing really that sophisticated beyond what people had been doing before, other than this function representation, and then the ability to actually train something that's so nonlinear.
And it sounds like what you're saying is using AI for physics is actually easier because like physics or the nature laws sets there as like a guardrail. So like
that
more
is so important. Yeah, absolutely. We are able to put in a lot of physical constraints and a lot of intuition already, and that actually is really important. The fact that the forces shouldn't matter on things like my absolute coordinate system. That's something that if you didn't have that constraint, this would be a very hard thing to try to learn. But the fact that I have a translational or rotational invariance, I could build that into the function approximation And then there's a lot of simplification that results. And really the most important one that I think has solved the force field fitting part is the locality. That particles only interact only a finite extent means that you really don't have to learn a global surface. You only need to learn local parts of that surface. And if you do that well enough, then things will work just fine.
Yeah, and actually, that's my experience with this as well. It's like we are actually utilizing the wisdom of all the great physicists before us, instead of just saying, "Oh, here's a bunch of data, run it through," and somehow expect the neural network to kind of recreate all those wisdom with,
Right.
Yeah, that seems a little bit too commanding for
right. Yeah, I mean, and it probably does. There's if you can get away without these heavy nonlinear functions, you really should. And so there's for most problems, at least in my experience, finding the middle ground somewhere between using the flexibility afforded by a neural network and then bringing in physical intuition, that's been the right path for most things we've studied. Right?
Yeah, and actually on that balance, I wanted to ask you, like, for example, because traditional computational methods like DFT, like MD is so well established, like when you faced with a problem, it's obviously easier to set up the solution in DFT or MD versus if you do the potential, then you have to do training and a bunch of overheads. So how do you sort of estimate or calculate what is worth that overhead to compensate for the efficiency of the solution?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a very good question. So in a general set of problems, that's something that does require a lot of thought. And usually, honestly, if we can get away with not having to fit a new potential to use DeePMD, we won't use it, right? But there are just big important right. I mean, but really, but there are big important classes of problems where you just can't do anything else. That in that sense, it really has been a game changer. And these studies that we've been doing with reactions at interfaces are really of that class. DFT and MD, AIMD in particular, those are tools that exist. But even if I had access to the whole supercomputer in my backyard, we'd sit right next to NERSC and we use it judiciously. But even if I was given that whole thing, I couldn't do the calculation that I did in that science paper. It really required something that was fundamentally different.
Got it. Is there like an estimate, like for example, if you were to do the traditional thing, like how long would it take?
For all of the calculations we did, it would have taken, so I think we did this at some point. So actually, I have a more precise thing. I used to quote this in some of my talks. I think the savings for the calculations we did was something like, even including training and everything, like a factor of 1,000. So it would have, so it would have turned, Mirza, the postdoc, still spent 2 years training these models and running all the calculations. So this would have taken 1,000 years, right? Something of that order. I mean, maybe if I was really lucky and got access to the whole supercomputer, maybe you cut that down by a factor of 10, but it's still 100 years, right?
Yeah, or maybe like Google came up with some quantum computer that actually works.
That's right. If someone had more than more than 10 qubits, maybe I would be in business too.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I noticed in your paper that in order for the potential to actually put into good use, you actually adopt something called umbrella sampling.
Yes.
I'd love to understand, how does it fit into the process and how does it interact with the machine learning protocol that you have adopted to change it? Does it make it better, or what's the relationship between them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So they both solve two distinct problems. So the DeePMD and the AIMD, or the AI force fields, really solve the length scale problem. We just couldn't represent a big enough system using other means. But if you want to study chemistry at an interface, you have to worry about representing a big enough system, but you also have to wait for the reactive event to occur. And a lot of chemistry, maybe even fast chemistry, something that takes 10 nanoseconds, that's still a long time scale from the perspective of an atom or a molecule. A typical time scale for a molecule to diffuse its diameter is a picosecond. So something that takes hundreds of nanoseconds is then millions of times longer than its kind of fundamental time. And that gets worse and worse the longer, the rarer the event that you want to see, the rarer the chemistry. And so what umbrella sampling lets us do is solve the timescale problem by saying that actually, if I wanted to see a chemical reaction occur, the typical time I have to wait for the reaction might be long, but it's not long because if the molecules are ready to react, they move that slowly. But the time scale is long because they have to get in just the right conformation in order for that reaction to occur. But when it occurs very quickly, or when they get in the right position, it occurs very quickly. So umbrella sampling is a way of finding and sampling those conformations which contribute the most to the reaction. So you kind of put yourself right where the system wants to react, and you compute the likelihood that they would have found that state, because you know how configurations are distributed with a Boltzmann distribution. And so umbrella sampling lets you put in a bias for them to go where they want to react, and then account for that bias in a statistical sense, in order to have something which is ultimately an unbiased estimate of how long it would take for a reaction to occur. So I think the takeaway is that the umbrella sampling is a means of seeing rare fluctuations that would have taken a long time to access, whereas the DeePMD force fields really solve the representation problem, seeing how setting up a system that's big enough to have seen those events to begin with.
So one's like making sure it's accurate, the other is making sure it's accelerated.
Accelerated and solving the rare event problem as opposed to solving the length scales problem.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it's relevant, but actually recently there was another group in Korea that uses DeePMD with umbrella sampling on atomic layer deposition for semiconductors. So if you're interested, cool. I can send you that link as well afterwards.
Oh yeah, please do. I'd be interested to read that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're trying to collect whoever is using.
Oh, sure.
Understand what people are doing with it, and we're just fascinated by the things that we didn't notice. Like there are people using it for cement. Of all things.
I wouldn't be surprised. That's a long-standing problem where it's the morphology of something like cement is the length scales there are so large that you just can't simulate, you can't represent that system in a molecularly detailed way with anything that approaches the right accuracy. Right?
Yeah, and there are people using it on glasses, using it dynamites, like explosion stuff.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
cool.
And there are people like researching packs, like the little smoke particles from the combustion.
Nice.
Like those are things like we didn't notice. We didn't foresee it being used that way, but it's kind of what drives us to read more paper every day.
Oh yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, I'll send you that afterwards. And congrats on being recognized by science. So what's next? Like, what do you envision AI or machine learning's role to be in like this broader environmental science space?
Well, there's an immediate next step, which is the ultimate science finding of that manuscript was really that there was a long-standing view of how this molecule N2O5, what the molecular steps are for it to be taken up by an aerosol. And these simulations let us kind of definitively say that longstanding perspective was wrong. That the majority of the reaction really does happen at the interface, not in the bulk. And so while that is really exciting, it comes with a big challenge, which there's a lot of consequences of that old perspective that now need to be reestablished and reevaluated. And so the kind of short-term goal is to figure out how to generalize this perspective to the full complexity of the atmosphere. So I have my student, Suk-Jin Moon from Korea, is actively working on similar reactions in other kinds of environments to try to patch up now a new model for NOx uptake. The kind of longer term goal, at least for us on the DeePMD side, is to keep fitting reactive models because they really change the game for what we can study. We do also on other sides of the group reinforcement learning based approaches for studying that rare event problem. So things that are spiritually kind of like umbrella sampling, but might work, for example, in systems that are not equilibrium systems where you can't do umbrella sampling for technical reasons. So these are actually more like in the spirit of what AlphaGo does. If you want to see a trajectory of a molecular system start somewhere and then end somewhere, which would be a very rare thing for it to have happen, you have to kind of teach those molecules what are the right steps to take in order to get that rare event. And so the reinforcement-based learning approaches that Google taught a computer to play Go with can be used to teach a molecule what are the right forces to interact with along the way to this rare event. And so that's really changed the game for what we can study in non-equilibrium systems where we don't have good priors for how to add those forces otherwise.
So if we were to take like a step back and say if I were a non-technical, maybe a policymaker or just someone concerned about the environment, like what do I take away from these pollutants being interfacially driven, not in solvents? Does that mean like maybe we tackle it by putting something in our arsenal to make the interface different, or like maybe do some catalysts? I don't know, shoot something like with a cannon?
Well, yeah, it's actually, I mean, this is a very difficult problem. So actually my colleague Ron Cohen is really the expert in the kind of real implications for environmental health. My understanding is that the NOx is actually in the US quite well under control, just by really making sure that you have low emission vehicles. So having good catalytic converters and things like this. I think, from my perspective, I was mostly motivated by, the basic physics and chemistry of how reactions could be different at interfaces. And, understanding those has large implications, because there are lots of naturally occurring cases, even outside of the atmosphere, where reactivity is occurring at interfaces. For example, cellular environments are almost all interfaces. There are proteins and membranes and all sorts of things that are catalyzing reactivity. And, we haven't had the tools to study any of those things. So, part of my group is starting to deploy these same sorts of methodologies for biochemical reactions. How does the cell start manufacturing proteins? That's something that would be very difficult to simulate without neural network-based force fields.
That sounds so interesting, and definitely looking forward to reading them. They're published.
Yeah. Cool.
Awesome. Actually, that's all of my questions. Really enjoyed reading your paper, even though I haven't read a paper for a long time. Well written, and the topic is very intriguing for me personally. And acid rain is a huge problem in Asia, South Asia.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, hopefully this sets a foundation, and someday some engineer can build something out of it.
Right, one can hope. Yeah, it was very nice to meet you and chat with you as well. So
yeah,
will you be able to send will you be able to send me a version of the article before it's published, just so I can check it for accuracy?
Absolutely,
okay,
absolutely. All right. And I'll send you that paper by the Korea team via email.
Oh, yes, please do. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Limmer. It's great talking to you.
You as well. Take care.
Hopefully we get to meet up in Cal sometime.
Yeah, I hope you get a visit sometime soon. So feel free to drop by. My door is always open.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Take care.
All right. Bye.